Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Jared Wright. And as the slide says, I'm going to be talking about the renewable hydrogen and green power fuel opportunities for South Africa. So, spoiler alert, I'd like to state that South Africa can produce renewable hydrogen competitively with other coastal countries, and that this has the possibility of giving rise to a new industry, supplying new export and domestic markets. The work which I'm going to present comes from a report commissioned by the European Union in delegation, EU delegation in South Africa, and the report is available for those who would like to request it. The report contains 6 sections, but I'm only going to cover the highlighted topics today: the international context, the markets and the South African opportunity, the economics of power fuels production, and even then only partially, the industries in South Africa most likely to benefit, and the barriers to South African and EU businesses in the clean power fuels opportunity. So what are power fuels? Essentially, they are products based on the hydrogen obtained by the electrolysis of water using renewable electricity. In the image you see before you, you will see a number of products arranged vertically, beginning with hydrogen, then a number of hydrocarbons, ending with ammonia. Now, power fuels are also known as e-fuels, obviously because they're based on electricity, also known as power to liquids, power to gas, or the catch-all power to X. They are all renewable synthetic fuels, either gaseous or liquid, an alternative to fossil fuels, and they will be necessary to meet climate goals in hard-to-abate sectors. Now, you may ask, why now? Haven't there been enough false hydrogen starts in the past? Well, my answer to that would be there's a convergence of several trends. The first is climate regulatory and financing. The Paris Agreement resulted in a worldwide agreement of the nations committing to reducing their carbon emissions such that global warming may be limited to just 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with the hope of being able to keep it below 1.5 degrees. The European Green Deal of 2020 essentially has the goal of having a EU which is climate neutral by 2050. Finance activism is that process by which, either through shareholder activism or other processes, the different financing houses have begun disinvesting from the fossil industries, particularly from coal. The second trend is the declining costs of renewable electricity. In areas of good renewable resource, good wind areas, good solar areas, renewable electricity has been competitive with conventional power sources since 2014. This is also true in South Africa. We saw in 2015, in the final bidding round of the REIPPP, that new PV and new wind came in 40% cheaper than new coal, nuclear, or gas-fired combined cycle gas turbines. Now, the third point comes to the issue that direct decarbonization is most efficient and most effective when electrification takes place directly connecting renewable electricity to the end use. Now, there are some sectors where this is difficult or even impossible, and power fuels provide attractive solutions there. The first broad area is transport. Heavy-duty, long-distance trucks cannot really be served by electric opportunities. Batteries do not have the range, and they don't have the recharge time to effectively penetrate the market. And here the emerging consensus is the use of hydrogen fuel cells powered by hydrogen with electric drivetrains. In aviation, the dominant vehicle is a high bypass ratio turbofan engine driving a wide-bodied commercial airliner. Now, there are no carbon neutral approaches which can challenge this power to weight ratio. So the emerging consensus is to maintain kerosene as a fuel, but instead of it having it based on ancient carbon, having it based on instead captured carbon dioxide and hydrogen from the electrolysis of water, and use that to go and make synthetic fuels. Shipping is based on heavy fuel oil, and here the emerging consensus make use of green ammonia. Rail is a special case, which is why it has an asterisk. Although rail can be electrified, and quite effectively, there are many rail lines that are currently unelectrified, and they are expensive to retrofit. Here, the emerging consensus is a hydrogen fuel cell drivetrain driven by hydrogen, which is an effective way of decarbonizing away from diesel. In industry, we have 4 main sectors: iron and steel, based on converting iron ore into iron. Here, the iron needs to be reduced by a reducing gas, typically carbon monoxide, obtained by the incomplete combustion of coking coal. Here, the PTX opportunity is to replace the carbon monoxide with green hydrogen obtained by electrolysis, completely eliminating your CO2 generating process. Cement is difficult for 2 reasons. In cement, you are turning calcium carbonate into calcium oxide, inevitably resulting in the emission of carbon dioxide. Also, this process takes place at temperature, and those temperatures are obtained by the combustion of fossil fuels. Here, the emerging consensus is to capture the CO2 emitted by the cement works, and use that captured CO2 to produce the hydrocarbons which industry is still going to need, thereby weaning them off fossil sources. Ammonia internationally is made by hydrogen from the steam reforming of methane, giving rise to carbon emissions. Here, making use of electrolytic hydrogen essentially decarbonizes that sector. Finally, plastics are manufactured from ethylene, and ethylene is a hydrocarbon exclusively obtained from crude oil or from natural gas. Instead, plastics can be made by captured CO2 and hydrogen from electrolysis. In actual fact, Covestro is already doing that. They're the old bioplastics. The final reason is the amazing public policy support for the bulk import of power fuels from various jurisdictions. I'll begin with Japan, who from 2030 plan to import 300,000 tons of hydrogen at a target price of $3 a kilogram. Over time, this will migrate to between 1 and 1.5 million tons of hydrogen per year by 2050. And Japan plans to introduce a gate at 2040, beyond which no hydrogen may be delivered that is carbon-based. In the European Union, the Renewable Energy Directive number 2 specifies that 14% of all energy used in transport must be of a renewable origin. The European Green Deal has ambitions to decarbonize steel and transport. And the hydrogen strategy of the European Union, recently released, states that by 2030 or 2040 at least, 40 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity is planned to be installed within the European Union. That is a lot of capacity. And then a further 40 gigawatts in what they call in the neighborhood of Europe, also supplying Europe with their green hydrogen. Germany alone, their national hydrogen strategy states that 3 million tons of hydrogen are going to be needed per year by 2030. But of that amount, only about 420,000 tons per year can be generated in country as a result of a number of reasons, which I won't explore now, which means that the remainder of the hydrogen must be imported from the rest of Europe and from renewable energy-rich partner countries. South Africa is a renewable energy-rich country in the German partnership community, so therefore we stand to benefit. Finally, the Netherlands has got significant space constraints, so land-based renewable generation is problematic. A significant fraction of the liquid energy entering Northwest Europe goes through Dutch ports, particularly the port of Rotterdam. And the Netherlands, understanding that the move away from fossil fuels is going to bring in renewable hydrogen instead, want to retain their port status. And therefore, they want to understand how renewable hydrogen can still be shipped through their ports, and they are gearing up significantly towards that. The Dutch plan sustainable aviation blending targets. And by sustainable aviation fuel, essentially we're talking about synthetic kerosene, seeing that biofuels are limited in terms of the volumes that are possible. The Dutch plan to have 14% minimum blending targets mandatory by 2030, escalating this to 100% by 2050. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a market opportunity. We know that Europe and Japan are both committed to the bulk import of hydrogen. And the very strong solar resource of South Africa, combined with a remarkably good wind resource, together mean that hydrogen can be produced at lower cost than most other jurisdictions, as can be seen by this map, which comes from the International Energy Agency report to the G20 meeting in Tokyo in 2019. Now, in order to make hydrogen, we need water in order to electrolyze. But South Africa is a water-stressed country. Sustainability requirements state that the water for electrolysis can't be diverted from communities and from agriculture or from the environment. So instead, seawater desalination gives us a more sustainable route. Now, the cost implications are not as severe as would initially be imagined. The desalination cost component is in the order of 2 US cents per kilogram of hydrogen. Now, that's less than 1% of the hydrogen target price. Now, obviously, for export, you want to eliminate as much cost as possible, which means you want to eliminate all overland transport, seeing South Africa does not have navigable waterways. This means that hydrogen for export must be generated at or near the port of shipment. And obviously, the feedstock is going to be desalinated seawater. This brings us to a recommendation. As part of the social license to operate, the desalination plants supplying the electrolysis plants for the hydrogen production should be oversized by 300%. And the extra capex costs should be built into the hydrogen price. And as you've seen, this hydrogen price will not be greatly affected. So the capital repayment costs will be paid for by the hydrogen business. In times of drought, the desalination plants are operated at full capacity. This allows the local utility to buy the excess water, paying only for the electricity component. Whereas during good times, good drains and full dams, you operate the desalination plants only at 30% capacity, supplying only the electrolyzer plant. Our recommendations for ports for export. For Europe, we recommend Saldanha Bay. It is South Africa's deepest port. It can permit vessels of 21-meter draft. It's in a very good solar and wind resource region. And it's in the Berg catchment area, as you can see from the map below, which in the intermediate future is predicted to be an area suffering from severe water stress. This therefore means that extra desalination capacity will be very welcome. We recommend the port of Coega on the eastern seaboard for exports to Japan and South Korea. We acknowledge that some voices have called for Durban to be such a port, and we argue against that. The Durban port is busy, whereas the Coega port is an underutilized deepwater port, and it can accommodate vessels of up to 14-meter draft. Coega is also in an area of good wind resources, again, unlike Durban. And Coega may be connected to good solar regions not terribly far away through the national electricity grid. It's in the Fish to Kaskama catchment area, which in the future will be subject to moderate water stress and also would therefore welcome the extra desalination capacity. So how do you transport hydrogen? Let's have a look at various feasible carrier options. We have calculated that hydrogen that South Africa can generate, store, and transport renewable hydrogen and deliver it to Japan, and therefore to the EU because it's closer, below $3 per kilogram between 2030, which is Japan's bulk shipping start date, and 2040, which is their CO2 free date. This means we are able to meet the Japanese cost target before their carbon deadline. It can be shipped most economically in 3 ways. As ammonia, because it's highly hydrogen-dense compound. It can be stored as liquid organic hydrogen carrier, which is a type of liquid chemical sponge that can store up to 6% by mass of hydrogen. It is stored at atmospheric pressure, at ambient temperature, requires no special handling, and so is particularly attractive. It can be transported as methanol at this particular price, except if the CO2 is obtained by the direct capture from the atmosphere. In that case, it becomes expensive. We'd like to point out that methanol is not Japan's preferred carrier. We're just pointing out economic possibilities. We must stress that we do not recommend the export of hydrogen as compressed gas or as cryogenic liquid, as that will be economically prohibitive. An unexpected opportunity is to export the hydrogen as steel, because one application for hydrogen is in direct reduction iron, or DRI. Instead of shipping hydrogen to make DRI steel in Europe, the DRI steel could be manufactured and shipped in Saldanha. Saldanha Steel is a mothball steel plant. Its operations were killed by cheap Chinese imports. Now, if they were to convert to DRI steel, they would face less market pressure because the steel will attract higher prices than conventional steel. And secondly, DRI steel will eventually be the only steel that will be unaffected by future EU border adjustment taxes. So what are the barriers to Powerfuels? What must change for PTX to succeed in South Africa? Well, there are a number of issues, as you can see on the slide. The first being legal or regulatory. The German national hydrogen strategy is clear. Power-to-X for export must not increase fossil fuel use or impede renewable energy in the exporting countries. This obviously means that renewable energy allocations are necessary and additional that are required for the production of bulk hydrogen for export. The existing allocations for renewable electricity under the IRP are necessary for decarbonizing the grid and for energy security. If they would be diverted to making hydrogen, then the German requirement would be violated. The renewable energy infrastructure licensing regime under the IRP is simply not geared for the large renewable volumes which will be required for generating hydrogen for export. Because to give you a sense of scale, we currently have in the order of 1.5 gigawatts each of PV and wind installed on a roughly 45 gigawatt electrical grid. If we were to capture 5% of the global green hydrogen trade, we will need 300 gigawatts of PV and a further 300 gigawatts of wind. The IRP allocations and licensing framework do not take this into account. A further regulatory issue is the use of PTX fuel for aviation and maritime purposes in international airspace and in international waters. The difficulty here is that this falls outside national and regional jurisdictions where the compliance can be demanded by means of a regulatory jurisdiction. This requires a global policy framework. Market support is required because PTX products cost more than fossil products, at least for now. And the PTX products from earlier plants are going to cost more than from later plants, much like renewable electricity generation. So support instruments are needed: incentives, carbon penalties, long-term offtake agreements, and things of that nature. CO2 pipelines are required. PTX hydrocarbons, and bearing in mind that the only legitimate use of hydrocarbons in a post-Paris world will be plastics and aviation fuel. These bulk PTX hydrocarbons at PetroSA and Sasol, are going to require a separate CO2 supply, because we cannot rely on their declining process emissions as they progressively become cleaner and reduce their own emissions. Now, most hard to abate carbon dioxide emissions in South Africa occur inland. Cement, 15 of the 20 plants are inland, and the significant steelworks are inland, Vanderbijl Park, for example. Now, CO2 pipelines are a known entity. There are some 2,500 kilometers of them in the US alone, which move about 50 million tons of CO2 per year. It is possible that CO2 pipelines can collect and deliver CO2 to Sasol, and from there, a single pipeline can deliver to PetroSA. We do not anticipate any obstacles or difficulties in human capital development or technical capacity. History has taught us, as part of the REIPPP, that international companies that invested developed the local market, developed the local supply chain, and developed human capital. Also, chemical engineering expertise exists in the various industrial sectors. This brings me to my last slide. Where are the opportunities? The industry is likely to benefit from PTX. If you need renewable hydrogen, clearly you need renewable electricity. So therefore, your renewable power developers are in a good position. Renewable hydrogen is already used in mining, where Anglo American is developing a mine truck, bulldozer, and locomotive for underground operation. Implats has got a hydrogen-powered forklift. Banks and investment houses are looking at investment opportunities coming from the hydrogen economy. Gas handling companies have opportunities. Urban bus transport is an opportunity for metros to decarbonize because buses are relatively easy to apply. And because the bus routes are circular and repetitive, you need few central hydrogen refueling stations rather than multiple dispersed stations, and that reduces your costs. In terms of long-distance trucking, there's a hydrogen valley being planned from Limpopo to Durban. We believe that Engie is leading the consortium busy looking at that, with hydrogen refueling stations all the way along the N3. We've spoken about ports. There's a possibility for electrolyzer companies. For rail, the city of Cape Town is planning or investigating the possibility of fuel cell locomotives to overcome persistent, ongoing cable theft. And the transport of PTX cargo on the trains returning from delivering product to the ports, to Saldanha for iron ore, to Port Elizabeth for manganese, and to Richards Bay for coal. All those trains return empty. So returning with PTX wagons allows the trains to generate revenue in both directions. We've spoken about steel making. In addition to Saldanha Steel producing MRI, the Vanderbijl Park carbon dioxide can be captured for reuse to go and make hydrocarbons. Similarly for cement, the CO2 can be captured and turned into methanol. As well as being added into the PTX market, this means that they have a new fuel that they can use for generating their own cement, generating calcium oxide from calcium carbonate, displacing fossil-based fuels. For the oil refineries, hydrogen is needed for the desulfurization of diesel. If green hydrogen is used, then these upstream emissions are removed. Methanol captured from CO2 can be used to dilute the fraction of ancient carbon in oil in aviation fuel. And finally, this brings us to Fischer-Tropsch refineries. We know that PetroSA is facing significant difficulties as a result of the supply constraint of their supply natural gas. Now, instead of relying on their fossil feedstock, if they were to rechange or redevelop their business model, making use of renewable hydrogen and captured CO2 to go and make PTX aviation fuel for sale into the European Union at premium prices, they then decouple from their upstream and downstream constraints. For Sasol, there are a few more difficulties, however, because they're located inland and the pipelines go the wrong way. So only in-country off-takers are possible at present. This means that the PTX business model for Sasol will need further development. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that has given pause for thought about the possibilities of renewable hydrogen. Thank you very much.